The morning of January 6, 1944, found Major General Jimmy Doolittle walking through the headquarters of the 8th Fighter Command at High Wycombe, England. He'd come to meet with Major General William Kepner, the man commanding these crucial fighters, and as he stepped into the office, something on the wall immediately stopped him cold. A message hung there in plain sight above Kepner's desk. The words were stark and unmistakable. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle read the sign carefully. He read it again. Then he turned to face Kepner directly. "That sign has to go," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "It's wrong." By that afternoon, a different message hung in its place. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. This single moment would prove to be one of the war's most pivotal turning points. What followed was nothing short of a complete reversal in fighter strategy, a tactical earthquake that would cripple the Luftwaffe in mere weeks. Fighter pilots initially called it suicide. Some of the more skeptical commanders dismissed it as reckless abandon. Yet history would reveal it as the strategic masterstroke that secured American air superiority across Europe. The mathematics of air combat were about to be fundamentally rewritten. This wouldn't happen through better technology alone. It would happen because one general had the courage to abandon established doctrine in pursuit of actual results. The crisis had been building for months, growing more desperate with each passing week. Back on October 14, 1943, nearly 300 B-17 bombers had lifted off for the second raid against Schweinfurt, penetrating deep into the German heartland. The target mattered enormously, ball-bearing manufacturing plants that supplied essential components for German war machinery. The bombing run itself went as planned. American crews unloaded their ordnance with precision, and the factories took a severe pounding. But the human cost was staggering. 60 bombers simply didn't come back. Another 17 limped home so badly damaged they'd never fly again. 600 young men were either dead or missing, lost in a single afternoon in the sky. For the bomber crews, the mathematics had become grimly clear. Completing the required 25-mission tour to earn a ticket home was statistically unlikely. Many wouldn't survive half that. During the worst stretches of 1942 and 1943, the odds of survival had dropped to somewhere between 25 and 35%. Lieutenant Robert Morgan piloted the famous Memphis Belle, and he was among the rare few who actually completed his full tour. That night, he sat down and wrote what he felt in his diary. "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell. The forts protect themselves well, but it is not enough. We need the fighters to go all the way with us, or we need to stop flying." The German fighter pilots had perfected devastating tactics over months of brutal combat. They would wait beyond the reach of American escort fighters, gathering their strength in large formations. Then they'd come in with head-on passes that ripped through bomber formations at combined speeds over 600 miles per hour. American gunners had only seconds to react. German fighters mounted 30mm cannons and air-to-air rockets capable of bringing down a B-17 with just one solid hit. The fundamental problem was painful in its simplicity. American escort fighters, the P-38s and P-47 Thunderbolts, simply didn't have the range needed to accompany bombers all the way to distant German targets. On the Schweinfurt run, the escorts had to turn back when they were still 300 miles away. From that point forward, the bombers flew on defenseless, fighting desperately against German interceptors that attacked with complete freedom. By December 1943, General Henry Arnold, commanding the entire United States Army Air Forces, had reached his breaking point. He issued an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. Unless the German Air Force is destroyed, Operation Overlord cannot proceed. American bombers cannot continue absorbing these losses. Find a solution or the strategic bombing campaign ends here and now. The answer to that impossible demand arrived in November 1943 in the form of a sleek silver aircraft that would transform everything. The North American P-51 Mustang, fitted with a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that cranked out 1,695 horsepower at war emergency throttle, possessed capabilities that seemed almost miraculous. Equipped with drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers 1,600 miles to any German target and back again. It cruised at 437 miles per hour, faster than anything the Germans could put in the air. At altitude, where thin air caused most engines to struggle, the Mustang's two-stage supercharged Merlin engine thrived. The fighter could claw its way up to 41,000 feet and still fight effectively at heights where German Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs began gasping for oxygen. Captain Chuck Yeager flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group, and after his first combat missions, he filed a report that captured what every fighter pilot suddenly understood. The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we have an aircraft that can go anywhere the bombers go and fight when we get there. This changes everything. Yet possessing the range to escort bombers all the way to the target was only half the equation. How these escorts were actually used would determine who won this desperate struggle. The established doctrine had pilots flying in tight formation around the bomber streams, staying always in visual contact with their protected charges. When German fighters attacked, American escorts would engage them, but only long enough to drive them away before returning to close formation. Defense came first, always. Anything else was considered abandonment. This defensive posture created a catastrophic tactical imbalance. German pilots could choose exactly when and where they wanted to attack. They maneuvered beyond visual range, dove through the bomber formation at maximum speed to inflict damage, then escaped before American fighters could effectively respond. The American escorts reacted to German moves but never took the initiative. They played checkers while their opponents played chess. Major General Ira Eaker, the outgoing 8th Air Force commander, had built this defensive doctrine into the bones of the organization. Eaker himself was a bomber pilot, and he genuinely believed that bombers could protect themselves through overlapping machine gun fire from their defensive positions. Fighters were meant to supplement that protection, nothing more. They were shepherds guarding sheep, not hunters pursuing prey. Jimmy Doolittle saw the situation with completely different eyes. Doolittle was not a bomber pilot. He was a fighter pilot, a test pilot, a racing champion, and a man who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He understood aircraft performance in ways that few others could even comprehend. More than that, he understood the deeper principles of tactical combat. The raid that had made Doolittle famous, the April 1942 strike on Tokyo by 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet, had required audacity, technical brilliance, and strategic vision all operating together. Doolittle had personally led that dangerous mission and received the Medal of Honor for his courage. Now he commanded the 8th Air Force with a direct mandate from General Arnold to solve the fighter problem. On January 6, 1944, his first full day in command, Doolittle met with General Kepner and issued an order that would revolutionize air warfare. Fighters would no longer stay defensively positioned near bomber formations. Instead, they would fly ahead of the bomber stream, ranging up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles to either side, actively seeking out German fighters. After the bombers completed their bomb runs and turned for home, American fighters would not escort them back. Instead, they would sweep across German airspace at low altitude, strafing airfields, destroying grounded aircraft, attacking trains and fuel depots. The objective was nothing less than the complete destruction of the Luftwaffe. It wasn't about shield wall defense anymore. It was about hunting down and eliminating the enemy. The order sent shockwaves through fighter squadrons and terror through bomber crews. Colonel Donald Blake Slee commanded the legendary 4th Fighter Group, and he grasped immediately what this meant. "This is what we've been asking for," he told his pilots, his voice carrying pure excitement. "Freedom to hunt. We're not shepherds guarding sheep anymore. We're wolves." But Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard, operations officer of the 354th Fighter Group, understood the bomber crew's perspective with painful clarity. "The men flying the forts and liberators think we're abandoning them," he said. "They believe fighters leaving to hunt Germans elsewhere is complete insanity. They don't understand yet that killing German fighters before they reach the bombers is better protection than shooting them down after they attack us." The bomber crew's fears weren't irrational or born of cowardice. They had survived previous missions precisely because fighters stayed nearby, driving off attackers before they could inflict heavy damage. Now those fighters would vanish beyond the horizon, leaving bombers apparently naked to German assault. Many crews genuinely believed Doolittle's order was a death sentence, written by a general who had never flown a bomber and didn't understand their war. For the Luftwaffe, the winter of 1943 into 1944 had seemed like a period of gathering triumph in the air war. Despite 3 solid years of Allied bombing campaigns, German fighter production had actually climbed higher. Messerschmitt and Fokker-Wulf factories were rolling out over 1,000 fighters each month. German pilots had refined their tactics against American formations into a lethal system. The heavily armed Sturmbok, Fokker-Wulf 190 fighters carrying massive cannons in underwing pods, could destroy bombers with a single determined attack run. These bombers were protected by faster Messerschmitt 109 fighters, whose role was to occupy American escorts while the Sturmbocker slaughtered the bomber formations. Major General Adolf Galland, commanding German fighter forces, genuinely believed the Luftwaffe was winning the battle of attrition. In November 1943, he wrote to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, "If we maintain this pressure, the Americans will be forced to abandon daylight bombing by spring." But Galland's analysis had a fatal flaw. He focused on aircraft production numbers while completely overlooking something far more critical: pilot attrition. Germany could build fighters faster than the Allies could destroy them in factories or on the ground. But Germany could never replace experienced pilots at anywhere near the rate they were being killed in actual combat. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 3,000 fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing in action. Training for replacement pilots had been slashed from 250 hours down to just 150 hours to meet the desperate demand. New German pilots were going into combat with barely enough flying time to operate their aircraft competently, let alone fight effectively against American veterans who flew twice as much as they did. Feldwebel Hans Dammers piloted a Messerschmitt 109 and had 8 confirmed kills to his credit. In January 1944, he wrote to his brother describing the deteriorating situation. "The new pilots last 3, maybe 4 missions before they're killed. They don't know how to dogfight. They can't work with their wingmen. They freeze when attacked. We veterans must protect them while also fighting the Americans. It's becoming impossible." The German dilemma would only worsen. But first, winter weather would delay the actual test of Doolittle's revolutionary new tactics. Heavy storms kept bombers grounded for days at a time. But on January 29th, when more than 800 bombers roared down the runways headed for Frankfurt, the new American fighter doctrine would debut for real. P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group screamed ahead of the main bomber stream at 28,000 feet, flying in loose formations that maximized visibility and reaction speed. They weren't chained to specific bomber boxes like Shepards. They hunted German fighters wherever those fighters might appear. Near Bonn, the American pilots spotted 50 Messerschmitt 109s climbing to intercept the bombers. Rather than waiting defensively for the Germans to attack, the Mustangs dove on them from above. The German pilots, expecting to attack bombers at their leisure, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against faster fighters with superior altitude advantage. 8 minutes of furious combat. 13 German fighters fell from the sky. 2 Mustangs took damage, but both made it back to base. The remaining German formations scattered completely and never reached the bomber stream. Captain Don Blakely led the 4th Fighter Group on a similar mission that same day. Later he described what the new tactics meant. "We caught 20 Fokker-Wulfs forming up over Cologne. They were slow, heavy with ammunition and fuel, just climbing to attack the bombers. We had speed, altitude, and surprise. It was a slaughter. We destroyed 11 before the rest could escape. This is how you win a war." The bomber crews flying over Frankfurt that day noticed something extraordinary. German fighter attacks, which normally began miles before the target and continued relentlessly through the bomb run, barely materialized. A handful of isolated attacks occurred, but the massive coordinated formations that had devastated previous raids simply never appeared. The new fighter tactics had intercepted them first. But the real proving ground came in February 1944 with Operation Argument, what everyone would soon call Big Week. General Karl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, conceived the operation as an elaborate trap. American bombers would strike German aircraft factories at targets so vital the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to defend them with everything available. The factories themselves were important, yes, but that wasn't really the point. The true objective was forcing the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle of attrition against American fighters that now outnumbered, outperformed, and outfought their German counterparts. February 20th, 1944. Clear skies over Germany for the first time in weeks. Over 1,000 American bombers from bases in England and Italy, escorted by hundreds of fighters, launched against 12 separate aircraft production facilities, the largest single-day air armada in human history. Major Erich Hartmann, Germany's leading ace with 352 confirmed victories, watched the American formation pass overhead. He understood immediately what was actually happening. "This is not a bombing raid," he told his squadron mates. "This is a fighter battle with bombers as the excuse. They want us to come up and fight, and we have no choice." The Luftwaffe responded with everything they could muster. Over 900 German fighters scrambled to intercept the American formations. The sky above central Germany erupted into the largest air battle in history. Contrails from thousands of aircraft twisted and crossed at altitudes ranging from sea level up to 40,000 feet. But this time, American fighters weren't locked defensively to bomber formations. They ranged freely across hundreds of miles of German airspace, attacking German fighters wherever they encountered them, on the ground during takeoff, forming up, or approaching the bomber stream. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts hunted relentlessly. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group spotted a formation of Messerschmitt 262 jets approaching. A revolutionary German fighter lifted into the sky from an airfield near Leipzig. Once these jets were aloft, they became formidable and fast, but the moment they left the ground, they became exposed targets. Drew accelerated downward from 30,000 feet, plunging through the flak and unleashing his guns at the leading jet. As it climbed away from the runway, the aircraft erupted in flames. Before the smoke cleared, he had destroyed a second jet, catching it before it could build enough speed to escape. The remaining jets scattered in desperation. Drew's account of what he'd witnessed would become the stuff of legend among fighter pilots. His report spelled out the brutal truth. These jets were terrifying once airborne, but catching them during takeoff and landing was the key, he wrote. Destroy them there, and they burn just like any other aircraft. The opening assault of Big Week exacted a heavy price from the Americans. 21 bombers fell, along with 4 fighters. Measured against the disaster at Schweinfurt, just 3 months prior, though, this seemed almost miraculous. But for Germany, the toll was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe saw more than 50 fighters shot down. Even worse, 38 pilots were killed or severely wounded. The bad weather would eventually lift over the next 5 days, and when it did, the bombardment resumed relentlessly. American formations targeted Regensburg, then Brunswick, then Schweinfurt once more, then Gotha, then Augsburg. Each assault sent hundreds of bombers and fighters into the air. Each forced the Luftwaffe into the sky to mount a defense. Each engagement claimed German fighters and pilots Germany could never recover. Major Heinz Baer, holder of over 220 aerial kills, put the nightmare into words in his personal diary. "We bring down bombers," he wrote, "but the fighters are everywhere. We climb to meet them, and they attack us before we can turn the fight around. We descend to refuel, and their strafing runs tear apart our airfield. We take to the air again, and they're already waiting. There is no way out." The mathematics were brutal. For every bomber destroyed, Germany lost 2 fighters and the men who flew them. By the 25th of February, when Big Week ended, the numbers revealed the grim story. Americans had surrendered 226 heavy bombers and 28 escort fighters, with roughly 2,600 casualties suffered. These were significant losses, certainly, but American factories and training schools could replace them within weeks. Germany's situation was the opposite. Over 350 fighters had been destroyed or damaged so badly they'd never fly again. More critically, nearly 100 pilots lay dead, and another 50+ were out of action from serious wounds. These weren't replaceable men. Each had spent 3 years or more in actual combat. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Ehlfeld, commanding a fighter wing, wrote directly to Galland with an assessment that reflected desperation. "We are hemorrhaging our most battle-hardened men," he reported. "The fresh pilots cannot compete against American pilots. In 3 months' time, we will have aircraft sitting on the tarmac, but no pilots with the experience to fly them in combat." Doolittle's strategy, however, extended far beyond aerial dueling. The second piece of his directive targeted German airfields and infrastructure with strafing attacks. As escort fighters turned for home after shield duties, they dove to treetop level and attacked whatever presented itself. Airfields absorbed particularly vicious punishment. Fighters parked in neat rows became sitting ducks. Aircraft undergoing repair, fuel supply trucks, maintenance hangars, ammunition depots, everything turned into targets of opportunity. German pilots described the horror of returning from combat to discover their own bases under assault, forced to divert to emergency strips or dodge cannon fire as they attempted to land. Major Günther Rahl, an ace with 275 confirmed kills, captured the psychological devastation in his words. "We once considered our own airfields sanctuaries," he said. "Now there is no sanctuary anywhere." The Americans come morning, midday, evening. Pilots who survive fierce air battles die on the ground. Mechanics are cut down while servicing planes. Fuel trucks detonate in fireballs. We simply cannot maintain operations when under constant bombardment. By March 1944, the cumulative damage became undeniable. 8th Air Force dispatched its first massive strikes at Berlin itself. On March 6, 730 bombers streaked toward the German capital, protected by 800 fighters. Berlin's symbolic weight meant the Luftwaffe had no choice but to respond with everything available. They launched over 150 fighters to intercept the formations. Hundreds of miles of sky erupted into chaos as fighters clashed and bombers pressed relentlessly toward their objectives. When the battle concluded, the accounting was grim. America lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. Germany lost 160 aircraft destroyed and 50 more too damaged to repair quickly. The pilot losses proved even more devastating. Nearly 70 seasoned fighter pilots fell or were wounded in a single brutal day. Recovery was beyond possibility. Captain Johannes Visser, commanding a fighter group, witnessed the catastrophe and recorded his thoughts that evening. "I have seen the German fighter arm perish," he wrote. "We gave everything and it was insufficient. They shoot us down faster than we destroy them. Their losses are fleeting, ours are permanent. Germany has already lost the war." From January through May 1944, the attrition spiraled into something the Luftwaffe could not sustain. German fighter pilot casualties exceeded 1,000 men, either killed, wounded, or missing. This represented roughly a quarter of every fighter pilot the Luftwaffe had available when the period began. Worse still, the highest-ranking and most experienced pilots bore the heaviest burden. The old guard, the aces with dozens or hundreds of victories, the squadron leaders, the group commanders, the instructors, were systematically eliminated. They fell because they fought with aggression, because they led their flights from the front, because they sacrificed themselves protecting inexperienced newcomers. 28 German aces with at least 30 kills were killed between January and May. 8 aces possessing over 100 kills were either killed or captured. Each represented countless years of training and hard-won experience. Each was truly irreplaceable. The pipeline producing new pilots could not keep pace. Germany sent 29,000 new fighter pilots through training in 1944, but the hours allocated had shrunk to just 110 total by mid-year, with some late-war aviators getting as little as 50 hours airborne. American pilots received over 450 hours of instruction during this same stretch, with 250 of those in their actual combat machines. Major Hans Philipp, an ace credited with 206 victories, described the inadequacy of new pilots in a final letter before his death in October 1943. "The young men arrive at squadron unable to even hold formation properly," he wrote. "Tactical thinking is beyond them. When bullets start flying, they panic. When they meet experienced American pilots with superior machines, they last one mission, maybe two. Then they're gone. We cannot train them fast enough. There simply is no time." Production numbers painted an equally stark picture. American factories manufactured over 22,000 fighters in the first half of 1944. German industry, despite spreading production across multiple sites to escape bombing, managed 9,000. The sheer numerical difference was overwhelming, but quality separated them even more decisively. The P-51 Mustang outclassed the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 in virtually every meaningful way. It flew faster, traveled farther, performed better at altitude, and matched or exceeded the enemy's turning ability. Colonel Hubert Zemke, leading the 56th Fighter Group with their P-47 Thunderbolts, summed up the disparity with brutal clarity. "We possess superior numbers, superior aircraft, superior pilots, superior tactics, and endless supplies of fuel and ammunition," he observed. "The Germans possess courageous men in decent aircraft they cannot adequately supply or maintain. Bravery alone cannot indefinitely overcome such inequality." By April 1944, the change had become complete and undeniable. German fighter strength, both aircraft available and pilots capable of flying them, had collapsed to barely 60% of January's levels. More troubling, the force's overall quality had declined precipitously. The veteran formations that had devastated bomber streams in October 1943 had ceased to exist. The new Luftwaffe consisted mostly of pilots still learning their trade, flying machines chronically short of fuel, desperately low on ammunition, and barely maintained. They opposed American formations that grew more numerous and assured with every passing mission. On May 8, 1944, 8th Air Force sent nearly 900 bombers to strike oil refineries and rail yards throughout Germany. 750 fighters escorted them. Not a single German fighter appeared to challenge them. The Luftwaffe surrendered control of the sky without firing a shot. General Galland reported to Goering that afternoon. "The fighter force is finished," he said. "We have aircraft but cannot fuel them for combat. We have pilots, but most lack the capability to fight effectively. The Americans attack whenever they choose. We cannot contest their dominance." The strategic consequences became evident on June 6, 1944, when the invasion began. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on that first day. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300. The overwhelming imbalance allowed Allied attack planes to devastate German positions, while bombers kept reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, sent an anguished message to his wife by June 10. "Enemy aircraft own the skies above us," he wrote. "Our soldiers cannot move when daylight comes without facing attack. Supply lines cannot get through. Without air protection, we cannot defend the invasion beaches." 6 months separated October 1943 from June 1944. Yet the transformation seemed impossible. The Luftwaffe had appeared capable of grinding the American bombing offensive into failure. Now it barely existed as an effective fighting force over Western Europe. The numbers from those half-dozen months tell everything. From January through June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,500 fighter pilots, killed or grievously wounded in combat defending the Reich. This equaled roughly 75% of the fighter pilot strength available when January began. America's corresponding losses totaled approximately 420 fighter pilots killed or missing, with 7,000 bomber crew casualties. These were real losses, but within American capacity to absorb given production rates and training output. The kill ratio had flipped completely. In October 1943, German fighters destroyed American bombers at a 20-to-1 advantage. By May 1944, American fighters were destroying German fighters at a 4-to-1 rate. Yet numbers alone did not capture the shift. Psychologically, the reversal was equally total. German pilots facing 1944 entered the year confident of victory. They ended it expecting death on every mission. American pilots who had dreaded German fighters at year's start were now hunting them eagerly. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who finished with roughly 20 confirmed kills, observed the evolution directly. "In January, we were relieved when the Germans chose not to attack," he said. "By March, we felt disappointed watching them flee. By May, we felt frustrated because so few remained to engage. Everything had transformed." Doolittle's strategy validation carried an ironic historical consequence. His choice, initially condemned by many bomber commanders as reckless, had ultimately rescued the bombing campaign. By destroying fighters before they could reach bombers, aggressive fighter tactics had proven more protective than defensive escort patterns ever could. General Spaatz acknowledged this in a June 1944 report. General Doolittle's decision to release the fighters proved decisive in gaining air superiority, he wrote. We destroyed more German fighters in 4 months than in the preceding 2 years. The breakthrough came from letting fighters hunt instead of keeping them bound to bombers. Major General Frederick Anderson, who had replaced Eaker as bombing operations commander, admitted his initial position had been mistaken. I thought keeping fighters tight to bombers was the only protection, he acknowledged. I was wrong. Destroying enemy fighters before they attack beats killing them during attacks. General Doolittle grasped this. I did not. The tactical shift extended beyond mere doctrine, reshaping fundamental concepts of air warfare itself. Before Doolittle's January directive, escort fighters served essentially as additions to bomber gun turrets. As the dust settled from the intense aerial battles of early 1944, military strategists reached a clear conclusion. Fighter aircraft had become the decisive weapon for controlling the skies. Bombers, it turned out, served a secondary but crucial role. They were bait, drawing enemy fighters into the open where they could be destroyed. This fundamental shift in thinking would ripple through military doctrine for decades to come. Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict that followed would be shaped by the hard-won lessons learned over Europe during those brutal first months of 1944. But air superiority, commanders now understood, could not be won through caution. You couldn't protect friendly bombers by keeping fighters close. Victory required something far more aggressive, destroying enemy fighters before they could ever threaten your own aircraft. Yet this strategy came at a terrible price. Over 10,000 American airmen perished in European skies during that first half of 1944. The bomber crews, flying mission after mission, each one potentially their last, displayed courage that seemed almost incomprehensible. The fighter pilots, tasked with hunting German fighters deep into hostile territory, showed remarkable aggression and exceptional skill. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group exemplified this sacrifice. He survived to become America's second highest scoring ace in Europe, with 27 confirmed victories. Years later, reflecting on what had transpired, Johnson captured the human reality behind the statistics. Tactics, strategy, numbers. These were important, certainly. But what truly mattered was that thousands of young men strapped themselves into cockpits every single day and flew toward combat, fully aware that many would not return home. America prevailed because of multiple factors working in concert: greater courage, sharper skill, superior aircraft, better tactical doctrine, and leadership willing to make hard choices. General Jimmy Doolittle grasped something essential. Protecting bombers meant killing fighters, not hovering protectively nearby. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased functioning as an organized defensive force. Individual German units fought with impressive bravery and occasional tactical victories. The revolutionary Messerschmitt 262 jets showed what might have been possible. Yet the systematic elimination of experienced German pilots during those first 6 months could never be recovered from. Germany manufactured over 36,000 fighters in 1944, the highest production figure of the entire war. The problem wasn't aircraft availability. Germany lacked sufficient trained pilots to fly them, insufficient fuel to conduct proper training, insufficient experienced commanders to develop winning tactics, and insufficient time to repair what had been demolished. Captain Erich Rudolph, one of the rare German aces to survive the war with more than 220 victories, understood the tragedy perfectly. Fighters existed in abundance by late 1944, modern machines, even revolutionary jets. But the pilots who could fly them effectively were gone. The Americans had systematically eliminated the experienced German pilots in spring. The war was already lost when German production reached its peak. Doolittle's strategy created a blueprint for modern air combat that remains applicable today. Air supremacy cannot be achieved defensively. It demands aggressive, sustained offensive operations against enemy aircraft and their supporting infrastructure. Technological edge matters, certainly, Yet training quality matters even more. Numerical superiority becomes truly decisive only when paired with qualitative superiority. Perhaps most critically, leadership capable of questioning established doctrine and accepting calculated risk can produce results far exceeding what incremental improvements might achieve. When Doolittle ordered that sign removed from Colonel Kepner's office wall in January 1944, it was far more than a symbolic gesture. It represented a complete reimagining of how fighters should be employed in combat. Bomber crews who initially saw this as abandonment gradually came to appreciate the logic. Technical Sergeant Andy Rooney, a Stars and Stripes correspondent who flew bombing missions covering the air war, captured this evolution in his June 1944 writings. "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us." This seems contradictory, yet it's true. When they flew close, Germans attacked regardless. When they ranged ahead as hunters, Germans couldn't reach us. The best defensive strategy is a strong offensive one. General Doolittle understood this. We didn't, but he proved correct. By the Normandy invasion, Allied air forces held complete air supremacy over Western Europe. German aircraft still flew occasionally, but in such diminished numbers with such limited effectiveness that they posed no real threat to Allied operations. Ground soldiers fought without fearing enemy aircraft. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, later acknowledged this critical advantage in his assessment of the invasion. The air forces provided the single essential ingredient for our success. They granted us freedom from enemy air interference. The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 ranks among military history's most dramatic reversals. That October, the Luftwaffe was winning the air war of attrition. American bomber losses seemed unsustainable. Strategic bombing appeared doomed. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe lay shattered. American bombers flew with minimal casualties, and Allied ground forces prepared their invasion under absolute air cover. The transformation bewildered German commanders. General Adolf Galland, in post-war accounts, pinpointed the exact turning point. When Americans changed their fighter tactics in January 1944, they won the air war. We could fight their bombers. We couldn't fight their fighters and bombers simultaneously. Once they unleashed their fighters to hunt us, our defeat was inevitable. Everything afterward was simply waiting for the end. The campaign's raw statistics reveal its staggering success. Between January and December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 4,000 fighter pilots killed in action over Germany. American and British fighters eliminated over 11,000 German fighters through air combat and ground attacks. German pilot training hours plummeted from 200 hours in 1943 to under 100 hours by year's end. American fighter pilot losses totaled roughly 750, with bomber crew casualties reaching 16,000. These represented substantial sacrifices, yet American pilot training facilities graduated over 35,000 new aviators in 1944, while factories produced over 63,000 military aircraft. The air combat kill ratio shifted dramatically. During 1943, Luftwaffe fighters achieved approximately 1.2 kills for each loss suffered. By 1944, American fighters reversed this to 3.7 kills per loss. In 1945, the ratio exceeded 7 to 1. Perhaps most revealing was pilot experience deterioration. January 1944 saw the average German fighter pilot carrying over 200 combat hours. By January 1945, this dropped below 50 hours. Germany hadn't exhausted aircraft supplies or fuel, though both grew scarce. The Luftwaffe had simply run out of competent pilots. Doolittle's controversial order had accomplished exactly what General Arnold demanded. It demolished the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting organization before Normandy. It proved that aggressive fighter tactics outperformed defensive escort methods. It demonstrated that air superiority required eliminating enemy fighters rather than merely shielding friendly bombers. The human toll was staggering. Over 26,000 American airmen died in European skies throughout World War II, more deaths than the entire United States Marine Corps suffered across the entire Pacific War. The 8th Air Force alone endured over 47,000 casualties. These airmen achieved air supremacy through extraordinary courage, exceptional ability, and profound sacrifice. For German pilots, the campaign proved catastrophic. Thousands of young men, many still teenagers, entered their cockpits knowing survival was unlikely. They displayed impressive courage and skill against overwhelming opposition until death claimed them. Nearly all the experienced aces, the veterans, the squadron commanders, perished in combat or ended up captured. Few survived. Major Erich Hartmann, history's leading ace with 352 victories, survived primarily because he flew on the Eastern Front. After the war, Hartmann acknowledged the devastating reality of the Western campaign. Americans destroyed the German fighter force over Germany in 1944. They possessed superior aircraft, more aircraft, better trained pilots, and superior tactics. We fought with courage, but we were overwhelmed. General Doolittle's strategy was brilliant. It cost us everything. When Doolittle ordered that sign changed in January 1944, many considered it insane. By June, it seemed like genius. Fighters existed first and foremost to destroy enemy fighters. Everything else flowed naturally from this principle. The Berlin raids, the destruction of German industry, the air cover for ground forces during invasion, all became possible because American fighters methodically eliminated the Luftwaffe across 4 months of relentless combat. What appeared reckless proved to be the only viable path toward victory. 7 decades later, military historians examining the European air campaign repeatedly identified Doolittle's January order as the crucial turning point. A single decision, one tactical shift, one general's courage to question established doctrine. These transformed the entire air war. Bombers returned safely not because fighters stayed glued to them, but because fighters destroyed German fighters before attacks could happen. The paradoxical truth that offensive action provides superior protection than defensive positioning became established doctrine. Air forces worldwide absorbed this lesson. Air control requires aggressively destroying enemy aircraft, not passively defending friendly ones. General James Doolittle retired from the Air Force in 1946. After commanding 3 major air forces, he received the Medal of Honor, multiple Distinguished Service Medals, and even an honorary knighthood from Britain. Yet of all his accomplishments, he considered the fighter directive his defining decision. During a 1970s interview, Doolittle looked back on that January day. Changing fighter tactics was the most difficult decision I made. Bomber commanders opposed it. Bomber crews feared it. Certain fighter pilots believed it suicidal. But my own fighter pilot experience showed me that offensive action wins air battles. You cannot win defending. You win by attacking. Losses were severe, but they would have been worse under defensive posture. We prevailed because we embraced risk and attacked aggressively. The sign Doolittle had removed now rests in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, alongside its replacement. Together they narrate a tactical transformation that secured European air dominance. Bomber crews who survived often credited Doolittle's choice with their lives. Initial opposition gave way to understanding. The most effective bomber protection came from eliminating enemy fighters before they could strike. For the Luftwaffe, Doolittle's order signaled the beginning of catastrophe. October 1943 saw them winning the attrition war. 6 months later, they were demolished as an effective force. American numerical strength, technological edge, pilot quality, and aggressive methods proved irresistible. The January to June 1944 campaign demonstrates military principles remaining valid today. Offensive action overcomes defensive tactics when capabilities are comparable. Superior training yields superior outcomes even when outnumbered. Technological superiority combined with tactical innovation creates overwhelming advantage. Leadership challenging convention and accepting calculated risk achieves strategic victories. Most fundamentally, air superiority requires destroying enemy fighters rather than merely protecting friendly ones. This counterintuitive principle, recognized by Doolittle and validated in combat across Germany in 1944, undergirds air combat doctrine internationally. The account of how one general's order to change an office sign led to Luftwaffe destruction across weeks reveals something profound about air warfare's essential nature. Doolittle recognized that fighters are fundamentally offensive weapons designed to kill enemy fighters. Using them defensively squanders their potential and surrenders initiative. Bomber crews who initially feared his tactics eventually grasped their wisdom. German pilots learned their effectiveness far too late. Aviation worldwide absorbed lessons shaping air combat for generations. On June 6, 1944, when Allied soldiers stormed Normandy's beaches beneath clear skies, empty of German aircraft, Doolittle's strategy had achieved complete vindication. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies for 5 years, which had demolished air forces from Poland to France, which had devastated London, was utterly absent. American and British fighters had hunted them into extinction. A single tactical shift, one doctrine change, one leader's willingness to reject conventional thinking had accomplished what years of bombing raids could not. The Luftwaffe fell not through factory destruction, but fighter elimination. Not through bomber defense, but aggressive hunting. Not through caution, but through seizing initiative. That sign came down on January 6, 1944. Half a year later, the Luftwaffe was finished. These two events connect directly, measurably, unavoidably. One general's audacious strategy destroyed the enemy air force in weeks, secured air dominance across Europe, and guaranteed invasion success that would free the continent. History would recognize Doolittle's fighter tactic decision as among World War II's most consequential command choices, not because of complexity or technical sophistication, but because it was fundamentally sound. Fighters exist first to destroy enemy fighters. Everything else follows from that essential truth.